Well, we've looked at the healing of the centurion's servant, and we looked at the contrast between the elders of the Jews who went to Jesus on the centurion's behalf and the centurion himself. We saw Jesus arrive in Nain just as a dead man was being brought out to be buried, and how Jesus brought him back to life and gave him back to his mother, a widow. Last week we looked at the account of Jairus' daughter and the woman with the issue of blood. And we noted that Jairus was probably among the elders of the Jews who went to Jesus on behalf of the centurion, and noted that he didn't grasp what had happened with the centurion and his servant. That Jesus didn't have to physically lay hands on anyone to heal them. And so the contrast of the first week of looking at the year popularity continued into last week, when not only does Jairus still not understand, but the woman with the issue of blood adds to the contrast by her expression of faith. There was also another interesting contrast that we didn't really note last week, but we do want to take a note of, and that is the woman had suffered 12 years with her illness, and her illness was removed. And the child had experienced 12 years of health, but then died and was restored to life. And so last week, we saw 12 years of sickness overcome and 12 years of health restored. And so today, we pick up again in Matthew chapter 9, but at verse 27, if you would. As Jesus went on from there, 2 blind men followed him, calling out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." When he had gone indoors, the blind men came to him and he asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then he touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done to you." And their sight was restored. Jesus warned them sternly, "See that no one knows about this." But they went out and spread the news about him all over that region. All right, so what we have been seeing is these things are happening in succession as Jesus has arrived at Capernaum. And so Jesus leaves the house of Jairus, and you can pretty much imagine the crowd is waiting for Jesus outside the house, which we'll see that later as well. And he continues moving through Capernaum. And he's actually preparing to leave Capernaum at some point and continue going to all of the towns and villages in the region preaching and teaching. And so we find he's apparently heading to another house. And I'm guessing, and this is only speculation, but I'm guessing he's going to Peter's house. Why? Because it becomes apparent that as you read through the Gospels, he stays at Peter's house when he is in Capernaum and has actually made this kind of his headquarters, so to speak. And so it would make sense that they would stop there before leaving Capernaum again, maybe to gather a few things, get ready for the next journey on out. And so, as he's heading toward the house, regardless of whose house it is, there are two blind men following him as a part of the crowd. And notice what they are calling out, if you would. "Have mercy on us, Son of David." All right. We are at a transition point in Jesus' ministry. He's very popular among the common man. But opposition is beginning to grow among the Jewish elite. And we begin to have another contrast unfolding. You see, in every instance of the blind calling out to Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, he records that they refer to Jesus as the Son of David. Even Mark records Bartimaeus using the same terminology when he cried out to Jesus. Luke also records the blind calling Jesus the Son of David. And this is a direct reference to the Messiah and is found repeatedly throughout the Gospels. And so we have this contrast in that the Jewish elite, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the teachers of the law, those who are supposedly enlightened, can't see or refuse to see that Jesus is the Messiah. Oh, they're willing to accept maybe that he's a prophet, a great teacher that's been empowered by God. I mean, after all, didn't Elisha and Elijah raise the dead and perform miracles as well? But they can't seem to see, though they're supposedly enlightened, they can't seem to see that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of David, yet the blind see clearly that he is. Interesting concept. And in many ways, it is also the contrast of arrogance as opposed to humility. I mean, this is even evident today. The arrogant can't see the truth and hold to their atheistic positions, many of them. And yet the humble come before God and seek His forgiveness. You see, at the heart of atheism is the belief that there can be no greater being than man because we have supposedly evolved from lower life forms and now we're at the top of the life. We are now the top life form. And so in their arrogance, they can't recognize that there is this all-powerful being. In their mind, we are the top. In their mind, we're at the top of the list, and everything else is below us. And their arrogance keeps them from seeing the truth. Those in the days that Jesus walked the earth, who were the ones that were considered the experts, were blinded by their arrogance to who Jesus is. And the humble, even the ones who were physically blind, could see clearly who Jesus was. But among the Jewish elite, there were a few who were humble. I mean, among them were Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who would later ask for Jesus' body and bury him in his own tomb with the help of Nicodemus. And so there were a few among the elite who would come to believe. But for the most part, amongst the elite, those who were supposedly enlightened, those who studied the Scriptures daily, those who were constantly teaching the Scriptures, they couldn't see it. Or else they refused to see it. And there's something else to notice here as well. And that is, if you would, at no time did the two blind men ask Jesus to touch them in order to heal them. Consider that. As you look through that passage, at no time did they ask Jesus to touch them. They just simply asked Him to have mercy on them. Think about this. Typically, at this point in time, if you were blind, you were a beggar. I mean, that's what we saw from Bartimaeus if we were to go to that account. He's sitting along the roadside begging. But these two have gotten up from where they were at or where they were standing, and they are kind of moving along with the crowd, seeking Jesus. Now keep in mind, okay, they're blind. Try and picture in your mind these two blind men trying to follow. All right? And you begin to understand why they are crying out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." Because they are trying to locate where He is at. They are trying to get into His presence. Almost kind of like the woman with the issue of blood making her way through the crowd, trying to get to Jesus. And so in their minds, probably what is going on is they're figuring, if we don't call out, Jesus isn't going to notice us, and we can't really see where He's at. So if we call out, maybe He'll come to us. But instead, Jesus keeps walking, and so they're kind of being led along by the crowd, you might say. They're having to follow the sounds to determine where Jesus is headed, where Jesus is going. And so you try and picture these two blind men trying to follow the crowd. Because if you understand what's going on, more than likely what is happening is everybody is making their way around them, and they find themselves falling behind. I mean, after all, they can't see where they're going. All they can do is follow the sound. And understand, Jesus could have just stopped right there. When they were calling out, I mean, obviously they could be heard. They're probably calling out as loud as they possibly can, "Have mercy on us, Son of David." In other words, "Messiah, help us." And Jesus could have stopped right then and there. But He keeps walking. He keeps heading towards the house. And they keep following. But as we look at this passage and what's going on, Jesus heading toward the house, these two blind men calling out for Jesus to have mercy on them. I wonder, how often do we fail to recognize answered prayers are a gift of mercy? Especially when there is suffering and that suffering is relieved. I mean, we thank Him. We're glad that He has answered our prayers in the positive. But how often do we recognize that when He has answered our prayers in the positive, it is a gift of mercy? But yet they understand that for Jesus to heal them, to restore their sight, it is a gift of mercy. And so they're following Him. He could have stopped, but He didn't. He keeps headed toward the house. And then we pick up in verse 28. When He had gone indoors, the blind men came to Him, and He asked them, "Do you believe that I am able to do this?" "Yes, Lord," they replied. Then He touched their eyes and said, "According to your faith, let it be done." Okay. So they've been kind of following the sound of the crowd. They get to where Jesus goes inside, and they manage to follow Jesus inside. And He asks them, "Do you believe that I'm able to do this?" To which they reply, "Yes." And in response, He touches their eyes and tells them, "According to your faith, let it be done." Now we need to make a note here. And let me start with a question. Would it have meant they didn't have quite enough faith if they had only received a partial healing? You know, perhaps they could see, but not very well. But at least they could see. Would that mean their faith wasn't quite strong enough? Wasn't quite firm enough? I mean, after all, didn't He say, "According to your faith"? I mean, isn't that what a lot of the faith healers say today? If you don't get your healing, then you just don't have enough faith. But I wonder if the expression of faith wasn't so much Jesus asking them, "Do you believe?" but the fact that Jesus made them wait until He was indoors, perhaps to test their faith. Perhaps to get away, or maybe it was perhaps to get away from the bulk of the crowd. But their expression of faith is the fact that they didn't give up. We need to understand as we look at the examples in Scripture that the power of God is not hindered by faith. I mean, when we find places where it says Jesus couldn't do many miracles there because of their lack of faith, what the writer is actually saying is He didn't do many miracles there because the people didn't come to Him. They didn't come and ask for the help. And so because of lack of faith, there were not that many miracles done. Not because He couldn't. I mean, like I said, we think about what faith healers say, you got to have enough faith if you're going to get this healing. But yet we find the example in Scripture is that just enough faith to ask is all it takes. And that the reality is God is not hindered by our lack of faith. But as we're reading here, Jesus has made them wait until He goes indoors. Like I say, it could be to test their faith or maybe just to get away from the bulk of the crowd. Maybe even both. But nevertheless, what we see happening is they follow Him. They don't give up. Even though they probably had a hard time pushing through the crowd to get to the door so they could get inside to where Jesus was at. I mean, try and imagine being blind and trying to follow Jesus with the crowd surrounding Him. This is no easy task. This is a challenge. This is a major challenge. And it would have been very difficult, and yet they didn't give up. And healing them according to their faith had more to do with their following Him until He responded to them. In other words, you didn't give up, I will grant your request. At some point, they could have very easily given up and said, we're just never going to be able to get to Him. And what would have happened? Nothing. And so his asking them if they believed was more for the benefit of those who were there. And when he tells them not to tell anyone, what happens? What took place? They told everyone that they could about what Jesus had done for them. I mean, how many times do you tell kids not to do something? Yeah, I see the smiles. Just the opposite happens. You know, don't touch that. Don't say that. You know, they say that more family secrets within the church are found out when the Sunday school teacher asks if there's any prayer requests for the kids. You know, what can we pray for? And all of a sudden everybody knows everything that was not supposed to be said. So, they receive the gift of sight. Jesus tells them to tell no one, but they tell everyone they can. Says the news about him spread throughout the region. Think about that. He gives us the gift of eternal life and instructs us to tell everyone, and what do we have a tendency to do? Say nothing. Something to ponder. Tells them not to tell anyone, and they tell everybody they can. Tells us we need to tell everyone. And how often do we actually do that? Then we have further confirmation of what we are talking about concerning faith to be healed in the next few verses. If you would. While they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. The crowd was amazed and said, "Nothing like this has ever happened in Israel." And so Jesus has healed two blind men. They followed him. They have asked him to have mercy on them. Never actually asked him to touch them, though he does as a part of the healing. And now they leave the house, and a demon-possessed man is brought to him. Now he and his disciples, probably followed by the crowd, they leave the house and are starting to leave Capernaum, and someone brings a demon-possessed man to Jesus. I mean, if Jesus' ability to perform miracles is blocked by the lack of faith of the person needing the miracle, then demons would never have been cast out. Think about that. If a person's lack of faith is going to block Jesus' ability to work miracles, then for the most part, demons would never be cast out. Not once did the demon-possessed ever come to Jesus and say, "Please cast out this demon." Never happened. Not once. And so, think about the various times that Jesus did cast out demons. Like I said, not one of the demon-possessed came to Jesus asking for help. They were either brought to Jesus, or Jesus, in a sense, came looking for them. For instance, we are very familiar with the account of Legion and the Gadarenes. He wasn't brought to Jesus. Jesus was passing that way and came across him. And I have a feeling Jesus chose to go that direction looking for him. That's just my feeling. I mean, Scripture doesn't explicitly say that, but that's kind of my feeling. Jesus knew he was there, and so that's the route Jesus chose to take. And so they're either brought to Jesus, or he happens upon them, or he's looking for them. He's going that direction and they're there. I mean, there's even one instance where there is an expressed lack of faith by the one who brought the demon-possessed to Jesus. In that account, Jesus has just come down from the mountain where he was transfigured and sees the crowd, and there's commotion, and Jesus asks, "What's going on?" And if we go to Mark chapter 9, verse 17, we read, "A man in the crowd answered, 'Teacher, I brought you my son who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not.'" Understand, The disciples that had stayed behind while Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on the mountain couldn't cast out the demon. But also remember, they had been sent out not too long before this and been given power to heal and cast out demons. But now they couldn't. And so after Jesus gives a short reprimand, we read, if you would, so they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. Do you hear the doubt? The lack of faith in the Father's response? If you can. So not only do we have a situation where the demon-possessed haven't come by faith, looking for healing, looking for restoration, even the one who has brought him is struggling with faith. If you can. And just like in Matthew 9, where the demon-possessed was brought to Jesus, so too now in Mark 9. And the boy's father, who brought him to Jesus, has his doubts that Jesus can do anything to help. And I love what follows, if you would. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief. The father essentially says he believes Jesus can heal, but he still doubts that Jesus can help his son. You know, maybe the others were deserving of the healing, but not my son. You know, maybe that's what's going on here. He knows it's happening. He sees it happening, but he's struggling as to whether or not Jesus can actually help his son. We've talked about that, haven't we? That idea of maybe I don't deserve it. Maybe my son doesn't deserve it. And those did. And we talked about that the last couple of weeks. And so here, there is a lack of faith openly admitted. And what happened? Jesus cast out the demon. And so this idea that if you don't get your miracle, you do not have enough faith, I'm sorry, our lack of faith does not block the power of God. If that were true, God would not be God. That would mean we're more powerful than He is. And so lack of faith does not block God's ability to heal. Typically, the understanding is the lack of faith resulting in not receiving a miracle, not receiving answered prayer, is the fact that due to lack of faith, we just don't ask for it. But yet there are even times when we are given answered prayer, not because it's our prayer, but because it's the prayer of someone else. Someone else had the faith to go before God and ask. Now let's go back to Matthew. You see, we are at a transition point in Jesus' ministry. Remember, we mentioned the past few weeks that Jesus is now very popular. There's crowds following Him. We even have the elders of the Jews and rulers of the synagogues coming out and asking Jesus for help, putting their stamp of approval on who Jesus is. But back in Jerusalem, where He has performed miracles on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders were plotting against Him. But now in this passage we see something else that's taking place, and that is their influence is starting to take on a new aspect. If you would. But the Pharisees said, it is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. As a part of their plotting against Him, they have sent some of their number to follow Jesus around. That's one of the things we begin to recognize as we look throughout Jesus' ministry, is that there are representatives from Jerusalem who are following Jesus around and sending messages back to Jerusalem. This is going on and that's going on. And some of those that are following Him, trying to keep an eye on things as a part of this plot against Him, are amongst the Jewish elite. They're Pharisees. Some of them are Sadducees. They're not staying in Jerusalem anymore. They're out mingling in the crowds, wanting to know exactly what He's going to do. And now they are beginning to openly oppose Jesus rather than just keep matters among themselves. They're no longer just observing. They're no longer plotting behind closed doors. They are now starting to speak out against Jesus. It's by the prince of demons that he drives out demons. And so now they are going to begin to openly oppose Jesus every opportunity they get in an attempt to discredit him and drive away his followers. The year of opposition is beginning to unfold as the year of popularity is beginning to come to an end. And as we mentioned earlier, we see the evidence throughout the Scriptures. The physically blind were able to see what the spiritually blind could not. The ones who were supposed to be enlightened, those who had studied the Word, those who taught the Word, couldn't see what was right in front of them. And yet, the blind come crying out, "Have mercy on us, Son of David. Have mercy on us, Messiah." Why were they spiritually blind? Many reasons. One, they gave the traditions of the elders more authority than the Scriptures, for one. Jesus was constantly reprimanding them for that. Many times, the traditions of the elders, when Jesus said, yeah, but what do the Scriptures say? Of course, then, there was their arrogance we've already talked about. Well, we're the ones, we've got the Word. We're the ones that do the studying. We're the ones that are constantly into what the Scriptures have to say. We're the ones who are the teachers. And, we know. We're the experts. I saw a post online this past week which said, if you are unwilling to learn, no one can help you. If you are willing to learn, no one can stop you. The Jewish elite were unwilling to learn. They weren't willing to accept that somebody might be more of authority on what God would want than them. And so their arrogance as to who they were, their position, got in the way. As far as they were concerned, they were the experts on Judaism, and this country preacher who hadn't studied under any of them was in no position to tell them they were wrong. Do you remember the time when the Jewish leaders asked Jesus by what or whose authority he did things? Happened a couple of times. By what authority are you doing this? You see, we need to understand a little bit of what's taking place in this time and period. See, they were asking because they didn't officially recognize anyone as a rabbi unless they had officially studied under a recognized teacher. And in a sense, were licensed to go out and teach. I mean, we're familiar with one of the teachers, Gamaliel. Apostle Paul says, I studied under him. And so they are essentially asking, who's your teacher? Who did you study under? Who trained you to be a rabbi and gave you the authority to do these things? Whose teaching is this? After all, you're a country preacher. You're from Nazareth. So who taught you? Who gave you the authority to do this? Of course, then there was their jealousy. We see that in the Scriptures as well. People are now looking to Jesus rather than coming to them. Not only are they looking to Jesus, he's got these massive crowds following him. The people had looked up to them, but now they were following this untrained country preacher named Jesus. And the Jewish elite never had the multitudes follow them. And the more he taught and worked miracles, the more they could see their authority being taken away. And his popularity has reached the point where they have to start trying to do something to stop his popularity from growing so that they don't lose their position in the eyes of the people. Plus, the Romans might take notice and think he's starting an uprising and come out and wipe them all out. Matter of fact, that was expressed when the Jews were trying to find someone to betray him. And so now they begin to openly oppose Jesus. But does that deter him? if you would. Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." No, it didn't deter him. Not only did he keep traveling and preaching and teaching and performing miracles, he openly said, we need more workers in the field. We need more who are willing to work for the kingdom. We need more workers determined to bring in the harvest of souls. Look out across the fields. They're ripened to harvest. There are souls that need to be brought to Christ. There are souls that need to be brought to God. There are souls that need to be harvested, and we need more leaders. And so while the Jewish elite are trying to stop him, he's saying, we need more help because there's more to be done. We need more who are willing to allow Jesus to transform them into his servants and will serve as he wants them to serve even today. The harvest fields around us even today are ripened to harvest. There are many in our own lives that we don't even recognize need to hear the gospel, who need to understand that Jesus is the only way. There is no plan B. There is no other option. God doesn't have several different roads leading to him like many will proclaim. Jesus bluntly said that he was the way, the truth, and the life, and no one could come to the Father except through him. He is the only way. And there are multitudes around us, even in this community, that need to hear that he is the way and that he is the healer. And that he never forsakes his own. So let me ask you this, if you would. Are you willing to serve and help to bring in the harvest of souls? Will you allow him to place the servant's mantle on you? Will you allow him to work through you and in you? Will you allow him to transform you into the servant that he wants you to be? I think that's one of the things that we have a tendency to forget. He's called all of us to be servants. All of us are called to serve. All of us are called to proclaim the good news through service. And so, will you allow him to place the servant's mantle on you, transform you into the servant he wants you to be, allow him to use you to bring in the harvest?